All right, good evening, everybody. I am so excited to have Chris Gilmour here tonight. And I've known Chris for quite a few years, and I'm actually surprised, Chris, that we haven't done something like this before. So I'm really excited that we get to work together. Chris has spent more than 20 years immersed in the world of growing food, working with herbal medicine, practicing permaculture, and of course, exploring the world of medicinal and edible mushrooms, which is why we're here tonight to learn all about that. Now, what's really amazing is watching Chris and his wife Laura as they develop their small scale. I don't even think it's small scale. I think it's amazing. Permaculture inspired homestead. Watching him use nature as his teacher, which I think is always really magical to see. And you guys who grow, forage, hunt, and fish for a significant portion of your food, right? And medicine.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We've come a long ways from me being a suburbanite, that was over 20 years ago, with this dream, of some degree of living off the land in a sustainable way. And when I say living off the land, I mean in a reciprocal way, in that give and take relationship with the land. But that's been a passion of mine for over 20 years now, is really coming into right relation with my food, and doing it in a way where I feel like I'm in right relation with all the other beings that we share the land of the earth with. So that's a big part of what drives me. And of course, being able to share it with other people is one of my biggest passions. My mom was a storyteller by nature, and I think I inherited it from her. So
Well, see, that's the thing that I really love. So I'd love to hear before we kick off and learn, pick your brain and learn everything about mushrooms. I'd love to hear how you went from, and I know it was a while ago, but how did you go from being in a city to being in a rural location, hunting, gathering, and doing everything that you're doing? Like, was there one moment that kind of like was a catalyst for that journey?
no, I think it's a lot of small pieces. It's quite a long story and probably beyond tonight's call. But if I was to share a couple highlights of it, I don't know what it was. There was a calling from a young age. My parents weren't necessarily outdoors people, but we went camping as kids. I had a grandma that used to take me out in the woods and or actually out into this old farm field, and we would go and paint flowers and things like that when I was really young. So there were some like little nature influences in my life. And I do enjoy reflecting back on that and really thinking about how these little things as a kid can completely influence, what we become later on in life. So there was definitely a few threads of those pieces. And then I did decide I wanted to do something with my life in the outdoors. I didn't really know well. And my first passion was kind of gardening. When I was like 17, 18 years old, I started growing vegetables in my parents' backyard in the suburbs. Took off to school to go work in the outdoors and had this like humbling experience when I realized like how little I actually knew about the natural world, and started kind of connecting with these people that opened me up to this idea that like, my entire life I listened to robins sing in my front yard and I'd be like, oh, there's a robin. It's making a pretty call. I'm now 20 years old. It never occurred to me that the robin is actually saying something. Like the robin's actually talking
Right.
about like, oh, the weather is about to change, or look, there's a cat next door, and I better get out of the way, or communicating with its mate. And it was just like this like light bulb moment, like, oh my goodness, like there's a language to nature, and it's
Mm.
being told in the weather, it's being told in the trees, it's being sung by the birds, and like for most of human history, our survival relied on us being able to actually read that language. And here I am, 20 years old, like spent my whole childhood in the outdoors, and I was oblivious that it even existed. So that was just kind of like this big like humbling like, oh my goodness. And it's been the last 25 years of my life is obsessing with that journey. So there's like the like nature's language part is the one part of it, and then the other part of like is how does that relate to food and self-sufficiency and living a more balanced life on the earth. So the second part of that story is, after I finished college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So Laura and I traveled around and worked on various different farms all over North America. Landed on a permaculture farm on the West Coast, apprenticing there, and that was our exposure to mushrooms. So this guy here was, we were running a market garden, but we would actually go and forage mushrooms and sell them at the market garden. So that was my first time ever. We were foraging for shaggy manes and oysters. And that was probably about 23, 24 years ago that happened. And then we also had this guy come in because we had a sustainable ecoforestry operation there. And I honestly, I didn't even appreciate this at the time, like how cool this was. I was pretty focused on like, I want to learn how to grow market garden organic veggies. And there's this little side thing that happened that like we would go and cut down trees, like selectively cut trees in a sustainable way, and then turn them into finished forest products. But this guy would come in afterwards and he would inoculate the stumps with mushrooms. And that was just kind of on the periphery of what I was doing. And now I'm like, oh my goodness, I wish I spent every moment I could with that guy. Because that's actually so cool what he was doing. And one of the reasons that that forest was so healthy and productive was actually because of the way that he was inoculating mushrooms into those stumps. Um, so yeah,
Right.
anyways, there's like kind of a long story short, that was over 20 years ago. And my wife and I have been running our homestead for 16 years now. Growing mushrooms, growing vegetable gardens, but like with more permaculture inspired ideas, but then also harvesting a pretty decent percentage of our food from the land as well through things like foraging and fishing and things of that nature. And trying to just kind of find a balanced northern lifestyle, that lives within relation to our local bioregion and the resources there, and that we can take enough to feed ourselves while still knowing that we're leaving enough for future generations. So that really is the hypothesis of life and that I'm working on.
Well, and I absolutely love that. Now, I think some folks may not know this, that you and Laura also, so you own your own business, Chris Outdoors, but you and Laura co-own Wild Muskoka Botanicals, right? Which is a business founded on making products from pretty much almost entirely foraged ingredients. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, not the products aren't entirely wild foraged, but every single product we sell through Wild Muskoka has something sustainably foraged for the woods. So we have a whole line of like infused apple cider vinegars with things like wild leeks or like pine needles. We do spices. We do a medicinal elderberry syrup. But then we get into fun stuff, like bitters for like making drinks and stuff like that. And we even do things like infusing mushrooms like into bitters. So like we have a chaga cacao bitters that has reishi and chaga mushroom in the bitters, which is like amazing in like a coffee or in a hot chocolate or. Mhm.
I've had it. It is really good. I
Mhm.
can attest to that. So I love
Yes.
that you've taken this love for nature, the outdoors, living this very like symbiotic relationship and have created a lifestyle, but also a business around that that can show the world that we can do this in a sustainable way. And that's the thing that I think is really magical because there's a lot of companies, and I talk about this a lot with my students and on my platforms too, that aren't doing it in a sustainable way. And I think there is a way that we can still, um, I don't know, like cultivate this really beautiful relationship with nature and do it in a way that we're not harming, right? And instead, we're walking gently on the earth and we're showing future generations that there's a way to continue to be good stewards of the land. And that's one of the main reasons I'm like so excited that you're here and you're the one who's going to teach us.
Yeah.
So I guess without further ado, do you want to just jump into mushrooms?
Yeah, I do. I'll finish off with one more point that landed up there. A
Yes.
minute ago, I kind of shared that like my story and what we're doing is a hypothesis, which might have been like, what the heck does he mean by hypothesis? But it is that hypothesis, like knowing that for again most of human history, people had to interact with the woods to be able to live. And if you're gonna act, you're gonna have an impact. Because I know there's, in this modern context where we're very much encroaching on these wild areas with cities and farms and things like that. There's I very much understand there's this philosophy around like conservation and let's protect the forest, right? Um, but when we protect the forest and then I buy from a grocery store and that food comes from very far away, like there's an impact of that as well. And we sometimes we don't think about like, cool, I didn't go and take from the forest, but that farm that cleared that land actually killed more wildlife than were impacted by me going to the forest potentially. So this hypothesis then becomes like, how do we interact with the land where we see the impact of our own, because everything we do has an impact, whether we go to the grocery store or we go to the forest to harvest. How do I actually be in relationship with that impact and do it in a way that it every year, those plants still come back, the mushrooms still come back, and I still get fed, and the birds eat, and the bears eat, and I eat. And really, I believe, I've been blessed to spend a lot of time in a number of First Nations communities, and
Mm,
something that I know of like the Anishinaabe people specific, although I believe or I hypothesize that this is true around a good chunk of the world, but I know for at very least the Anishinaabe nation here on the east coast of Canada and the US, we often think that, first contact, people came over from Europe and these were like these virgin untouched forests. But it's actually not true. The Anishinaabe people were forest gardeners. They were literally tending the forest. They were planting seeds, they were pruning trees, they were doing controlled burns. So they were actually having a big impact on the forest long before Europeans made it over to this continent. So I've been very, very inspired by that idea that like people could live in that kind of relationship with the land and their food, and that maybe the food, maybe it doesn't look like a modern garden, but the forests actually are a garden, and they have been for many, many thousands of years here. So I'm very much on a quest to reclaim that, and that's why I kind of refer to it as a hypothesis.
And I love that. I think that all of us could be inspired to kind of walk in those similar footsteps and look at it. I love that, the idea that it's a hypothesis, right? And something that we are constantly revisiting, pondering, and tweaking as we learn more and kind of like digest and bring more knowledge in. Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited. I can't wait to hear what you have to teach us tonight. I'm sure Chris will mention this as well, but I just want to say there will be a Q&A period at the end. Now, that being said, I am keeping an eye on the chat. Chris is going to be focused on wowing you with all of his amazing knowledge, but I'll keep an eye on the chat and copy and paste questions. So if you have them, you can drop them in there, or you can just wait until the end, whatever works for you. And without further ado, I bring you Chris Gilmour.
Awesome. Right on, folks. So I'm just gonna unpin you for a second here, Kareen, and then I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, and just so folks know, maybe I'll kind of go over what our game plan is here for the night. Um, so of course, this is our introduction to mushroom growing and foraging, and you can't get into mushroom growing and foraging, at least not sustainably and ethically, without talking about ecology. So we're definitely going to kind of dive into the fascinating role of fungi in ecosystems as part of this. So tonight's plan, I'm gonna do a quick intro. Actually, we kind of just did the intro, so I probably won't actually say much more about that. Just around our mushroom learning journey. I want to dive into mushroom ecology and the role of fungi in nature. I'm going to share, kind of a bit of an introduction to easy ways to grow at home, both indoors and out, and what are some of the best techniques to start with, what are some of the best species to talk with, and then we're going to kind of transition into safe and sustainable wild foraging. And then we're also going to chat about other learning opportunities if you want to go a bit more deeper. And there's a few opportunities coming up that some of you may be interested in. So I'll let you know a little bit about that if you were really inspired and you want to kind of go a little bit deeper with me or my wife Laura, who's not here with us tonight. So that's our game plan. And the main kind of talk will be probably around an hour, so including this intro we just did with Kareen, and then we'll stick around to do some Q&A after that. So I'd imagine we're looking at somewhere between an hour and 10 and an hour and 30 minutes, depending on how long the Q&A goes for at the end. But within the hour, hopefully we'll be through the bulk of the kind of main presentation. Yeah, so that's kind of our game plan for tonight. Yeah, thanks so much, Kareen, too. I just want to, share a little bit of gratitude for you bringing me in here tonight and allowing me to share my passion with this group. And I'll also just share a bit of gratitude for the fungi themselves, we have this in-person course that we run, and actually, you know what? I'm going to slip to this slide. This is the slide I usually have up when I tell my story, but I'm not going to retell it because I kind of did. But I think the part that I'm going to share because it relates to the perspective that I teach from, and that's an evolving thing as well. You could call it a hypothesis as well, maybe. But we run this course, and I shouldn't say we. It's actually more my wife Laura, who you see in the picture there with that big pile of shiitakes and those nice cauliflowers. And Laura actually came up with the name of it. It's a three-part in-person class called Fungi as Kin. And it's kind of reframing this idea of this taker relationship that humans often find themselves in with the landscape. And I'll put up my hand and say I was very guilty of this early on in my journey. I was very inspired when I first learned, like, hey, you can go to the woods and eat plants. Sweet, show me what I can eat and let me put it in my basket and put it in my mouth. And there's nothing, inherently wrong with that. Um, but I've been really, I've had my philosophy around that really challenged, especially as I am blessed by the opportunity to look at kind of indigenous perspectives. And again, I've mentioned spending some time in many different First Nations and specifically Anishinaabe communities, where it's really about being in relationship with the land. It's much different than just going out and like, what can I harvest and take for my own good? It's like, how do I be in a reciprocal give and take relationship of it? And when I think about the realm of fungi, our main topic for tonight, the more I learn and come into relationship with fungi, the more I realize like how much our how do I even say this? First off, they're a foundational species to the Earth's ecosystem. Like if you take fungi out of the ecosystem, everything else collapses, right? Like fungi are essential for building soil. They're essential for breaking down carbon. So when a tree dies, like it needs fungi to help break that down and turn it back into soil, right? So they're a foundational cornerstone species for the entire Earth's ecology. And because of that, us as humans have actually evolved alongside them. And you can look at the role of fungi in human history throughout the centuries and really literally over tens of thousands of years. And the number of things that fungi have provided the human species is actually amazing. And the ways that, we've literally physically and culturally evolved alongside our relationship with fungi as well as plants and really all the other animals and things we share this planet with. So I really teach kind of from that relational perspective, or at least I do my best to try to do that. And part of that is kind of honoring the lineage of the original caretakers of this land and the caretakers today, and the many indigenous nations that held that kind of wisdom. So I just want to kind of honor that in this moment and honor the fungi themselves for what they've done for us, what they do for the planet. And I think they have a lot to offer us in context to this modern world that's actually quite challenging and sometimes feels disconnected. Um, from their ability to actually help us grow a lot of really nutritionally dense food in a small space, to the medicine, like the amount of research coming out in the medicinal compounds of fungi right now is mind blowing. And the amount that actually relates to some of these um, diseases and conditions that are becoming an epidemic in our modern time. Like the fungi have so much to offer us in healing our human bodies or just supporting our human bodies in this somewhat unnatural, stressful modern world that we've created. So they have a lot of gifts for us in that nature as well. So gratitude for the fungi and gratitude for all the teachers. And oh yeah, I better finish that story. What I was saying, Laura created a course called Fungi as Kin. And we were trying to reframe it from people showing up in classes because we run these one day foraging walks on our land up here in Muskoka. And people would inevitably just show up with their basket and be like, oh, sweet, I'm coming here to go and take a bunch of things and bring it home in my basket to eat. And we've been really trying to shift the dialogue to like, no, you're actually coming here to come into relationship with this really, really important cornerstone species on the earth. And if we're lucky, it might share some food with us while we're out there today. But it's probably going to teach us some things that go way beyond the food and the medicine that we're harvesting as well. So let's dive in. I will just, Kareen did mention Wild Muskoka. If that piqued anybody's interest, you can check it out, wildmuskoka.com. That's the wild foraged food and drinks business that we were talking about there. Of course, I offer things like this for free. So by supporting things like Wild Muskoka, it supports free stuff like this going out in the world as well. So we're going to start. Part one of tonight is going to be talking a little about the ecology. And this actually is very, very important when it comes to thinking about good stewardship as well as safety. So in front of you here, we have two different species of fungi. I'm going to guess that some folks on here probably know what these two species are, and I'd imagine some of you have no clue. And either are great, but there's something that's very foundationally different about the life cycle of these two species and their role in the natural world. If you want to, if you've got an idea, you could throw it in the chat. I'm not actually able to look at the chat, but Kareen could take a look there. So maybe if you got thoughts on who these two species are, throw it in the chat. And then question number two is what's like very, very different about their life cycle? And this is very much going to relate to sustainable foraging. So the fungi on the left is probably, arguably, one of the most trendy and popular mushrooms right now, the chaga fungus. And calling it a mushroom is actually incorrect. I'm going to call it a fungi. So the chaga fungi on the left there. The one on the right, that little bit of red with that white belt, is the reishi mushroom. And it is appropriate to call that one a mushroom. And where they're very, very different, they both grow on trees, but the chaga actually grows on trees that are still alive, and very specifically on birch trees. And the chaga is actually something called a parasitic mushroom. Like it falls into a classification called a parasitic mushroom. And what usually happens is you have a tree like a birch tree, and let's say a branch falls off, and the chaga spores are kind of floating through the air. They land where that branch fell off. The birch is still alive, and the chaga actually now comes into a relationship with that birch tree, and it starts to grow very, very slowly over time. You can find chaga fungi like this black, it kind of looks like, charred black wood there, that are 20, 25, 30, even 35 years old. And it is a parasite. It will eventually kill the birch tree. But the other thing that's important to know is like if that chaga hadn't landed there, I mean, that birch tree already had the wound. So it was already transitioning towards dying and decomposing anyways. And, some cases, I honestly think the chaga actually extends the lifetime that birch has because it seals the wound and it stops moisture and other more aggressive funguses from getting in there. So it is a parasite on the mushroom, but there's also a symbioticness that happens there as well, which is kind of interesting, because people get parasites and some of them are very detrimental to us, but some of them are actually quite normal. And we do live in some degree of symbiosis with them, you know, when you think about our human ecosystem. So our human internal ecology. Now, why I share all this is super, super important to know because a chaga, actually, you know, I'm going to go to the reishi next, and then we'll talk about why it's important. So the reishi mushroom grows on dead trees and specifically dead hemlocks. This species of mushroom, this is Ganoderma tsuge, our hemlock reishi. And the spores will basically land on a hemlock tree that has already died. And it's not a parasitic mushroom, it's what we call a saprophytic mushroom. And a saprophytic mushroom basically means that it eats dead wood and helps it decay and turn into soil. So it's basically eating the carbon from that wood. And what's really neat about a reishi mushroom, so if you get a big old hemlock and it gets the reishi mycelium or spores land on it, the mycelium grows through it, and then these mushrooms start growing out the side, that tree is probably going to produce reishi mushrooms in that same spot year after year for anywhere, you know, maybe 2, 3 years. It could even go be upwards of 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the size of the hemlock tree. So it produces mushrooms year after year after year. And every single year, the mushrooms drop spores, which allows that reproduction cycle to continue. If you didn't know this about fungi, this is actually really interesting. And when I first heard this, it was like kind of one of those like mind-blowing moments where I was like, what? You're kidding me. Because we often think about mushrooms as like the organism. It's like, oh, there's a mushroom. That's what it is, a mushroom. But the mushroom is actually the fruiting body of a much larger organism, which is the mycelium, which is the part that we can't see that's living in the wood. So a better way to look at a mushroom is like looking at an apple on an apple tree, right? The apple is not the organism. The apple is the fruit that the tree produces when it's ready to reproduce. The organism is the tree and the roots and, you know, all those other things going on inside of it and under the soil that we can't see. And then it produces an apple to reproduce. It's the same with mushrooms and mycelium. The organism is the mycelium, which has this way bigger role and is much larger than the mushrooms itself. When the mycelium is ready to produce, it produces mushrooms to help release those spores or seeds so it can reproduce itself. So why do I all say this? How does it relate to sustainable foraging, right? In theory, and I'm saying in theory, very intentionally, I could go to that hemlock tree and I could cut every single one of those reishi mushrooms off, and they're going to grow back next year. And I'm not going to actually prevent them from growing back the next year by taking all the mushrooms. Now, I would never argue doing that, and this is, you know, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. I've heard foragers justify it's okay to take all the mushrooms off of a tree or from the ground because they are going to come back next year. And yes, they are going to come back next year. You're right. And taking all of them is not going to stop them from coming back because you're not taking the mycelium. When I bring us back to how I started this whole talk, bringing in that being in relationship with the fungi and living in a reciprocal way with our environment, we're neglecting what other roles do those mushrooms play beyond just feeding us as humans, and is there more to the role beyond just they will come back next year, right? I would argue that those mushrooms falling to the ground are essential in building soil. They're creating habitat for insects, and many animals eat mushrooms for food, but also medicine. Animals absolutely eat mushrooms for their own medicinal needs, right? So if we take all the mushrooms from that reishi tree, we're just completely neglecting all those other roles that it plays beyond just feeding us. So for me, that idea that they're going to come back next year isn't enough to justify that I can take them all. So there's a thought. Let's go over to chaga right now, though, because chaga is very fundamentally different. So that 20 years, let's say we have a chaga and it grows for 20 years on that birch tree. It's not releasing spores every year. And it's actually there year round. And every year it's getting a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. The mycelium is growing all through the tree. It's not actually until 20, 30 years later when the tree actually dies and the chaga falls off, and then it doesn't actually release the spores from the chaga like the reishi does. The birch bark splits open, and all the spores actually come out from the wood of the tree. And the mycelium actually releases this massive amount of spores through the whole tree. Laura and I actually came across this for the first time ever this summer, which is an incredibly rare thing to come across. It was really beautiful. It was a beautiful sunny day, and we're coming through the woods, and there was like a mist around this birch tree. And at first we were like, what's up with that? There's literally like a mist around there, and we got up close and we realized that the tree was actually sporing, like the whole tree. It was such a beautiful thing. But here's the thing, so sustainability wise, I see this beautiful chaga. I've heard it's great for medicine. I go up there and I just rip the whole thing off of the tree and I rip it right down to the base. Now I've just reopened up that wound. Now the windstorm comes along and some fungi get in there and the birch snaps and the tree falls over. The chaga never releases its spore. It never gets to reproduce itself within the ecosystem. So over harvesting chaga absolutely has the ability to reduce the amount in the landscape. Where, over harvesting reishi is probably not going to do that, although there's other reasons not to do it. So when we're harvesting chaga, we would never take that entire piece off. We would take a small amount off of it, and I would always make sure there's a full seal left on the wound of the tree itself, because that's what's protecting the tree from other things getting in there. And what's amazing, if I cut off a third of that chaga mushroom, or fungi, it'll actually continue to grow still. And I can come back in a few years and actually cut off there again. So you might be able to harvest from the same chaga fungi for 15 years, coming back every few years and taking a piece off of it, right? Um, that reishi mushroom is probably only going to fruit for maybe 5 years on that tree, and then it's gone, and it'll never fruit from that spot again. Its spores will move it over to another host. So there's a reason why understanding ecology becomes really, really important in actually implementing sustainable and ethical foraging practices in the first place. Okay, so a little bit about just the mushrooms ecology. Have kind of hinted on some of these already. I'm not going to spend too much time here because I kind of want to get into the growing and foraging specifics. But mushrooms are responsible for symbiotic. I should say responsible for. Mushrooms play a big role in symbiotic relationships between different species. Um, so those two plants on the right. Here's another pop quiz. I'm gonna have a sip of water here. Who knows what the two plants on this picture are right now? There's two different plants there, and there's a third one I could actually throw into the mix here. So what are these two plants right now? Question number one. Question number two, though, is what do they have in common? And there's a third one I'm going to throw in here, which is club moss. So we have a fern on the bottom, we have a horsetail on the top, and we have club moss. And those three plants have something very interesting in common. And I wonder, Creed, did anybody say spores?
No, no one has said spores, but quite a few people guessed fern and horsetail, though. So,
Awesome. Awesome. So ferns, horsetail, and club moss are all spore producing plants. All of our other plants reproduce by seeds, including trees. And it's thought that ferns, horsetails, and club moss are some of the oldest plants on Earth. And basically, they evolved. If you can imagine, at one time, you've got like single cell organisms that are growing across the Earth's surface. And every single part of that cell needs to be able to photosynthesize from the sun and basically do everything. It has no way to move fluids from one cell to the next. So every single cell has to be able to photosynthesize from the sun. How did plants begin to grow up off of the Earth's floor? Well, they had to be able to carry moisture and nutrients throughout them. So it's believed that the original plants actually created symbiotic relationships with fungi. And it was the fungi that allowed it to start growing up off the Earth's floor. And the fungi actually carried the nutrients up and down the plant for the plant. And in exchange, the fungi got better photosynthesis because the plant could reach up towards the sky, right? And isn't it interesting that the first three plants that we believe evolved off the floor actually reproduce by spore, the same way that fungi reproduce? And then over time, they evolved these more complex seed structures that we now have our modern plants and trees. So that's I find just mind-boggling in and of itself and fascinating. So yeah, we already talked about how important they are for decomposing nutrients and cycling and soil building. They're also really significant food sources for wildlife as well. So there's some of the many roles that they have in nature. Um, we chatted a little bit about this already, so I'll maybe just hit on this quickly. We talked about these are three different kind of classifications of mushrooms, and there's actually lots of different ways that we could group them or classifying them beyond this. Um, but one way that we could classify mushrooms or category or grouping would be these saprophytic mushrooms. And this is actually really important for our talk tonight on growing and foraging as well, because pretty much all of the mushrooms that we grow are saprophytic mushrooms. Humans haven't really been able to figure out how to grow mycorrhizae fungi or parasitic mushrooms yet. we've been able to figure out how to grow saprophytic mushrooms. So almost all of the ones, if you go to the grocery store and, whether it's button mushrooms or portobellas or shiitakes or oysters, they're all saprophytic mushrooms. Saprophytic mushrooms being the decomposers that break down wood. So those are the ones we're going to focus on in our growing section. Mycorrhizae fungi are the ones that actually often grow in the soil and the debris layers. And those ones are often responsible for those symbiotic relationships, like between trees and different beings. So, one of the ID features for identifying certain types of edible mushrooms is actually what other species are they growing around. So when we go looking for, chanterelle mushrooms, for example, up on our property, we actually look for what trees are growing in the area as one of the ID features to know that it is a chanterelle and it's not a poisonous lookalike, like something like a jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which is a poisonous lookalike of the chanterelle. So if we want to be able to forage mushrooms, we also need to know our plants and our trees because the mushrooms grow in relationship to other trees. And often which trees are there tells us, is this the mushroom we think it is or not? And the reason that they grow together is they are actually in relationship with each other. Like the mycorrhizae, mycelial threads of the fungi actually interlock with the roots of the tree and they actually exchange energy and nutrients with each other, right? And if you can imagine how beneficial that would be to a tree, because the tree's roots only get so big, the fungi mycelium can go out and out and out. There's tracked fungal masses that are larger than football fields. So one fungal organism that's larger than a football field underneath the Earth's surface. If a tree taps into that, wow, now it has access to food and water and information way beyond its root zone. And if the fungi taps into the tree, it's able to actually send its roots up and has all kinds of benefits it gets from the tree as well. So those are mycorrhizae fungi in that symbiotic relationship part. The last one is the parasitic mushrooms, and I won't share too much about that one because we just gave the example of chaga. But some other ones, cordyceps is a popular one that people take for its health. Cordyceps actually parasitize a certain type of insect, which is interesting. Or honey mushrooms, are a popular edible mushroom. They're another version of a parasitic mushroom. All right, now we're starting to transition into the growing phase. And before we can start getting into growing, we need to understand the life cycle of a mushroom because it has different needs at different phases of its growing cycle. So if I look at the life cycle of a mushroom, we're going to start at the top here. And the first one is it produces a fruit, right, which is the mushroom. And then it releases its spore, which is kind of like the seed. That spore floats out across the landscape and it's going to land, on various different substrates. And by substrate, I just kind of mean like the food source. And in nature, it may or may not land on a food source that it can actually consume. So the majority of spores that come off of a mushroom will probably never turn into more mushrooms or never even turn into a mycelial mass. They'll actually dry up and just die there, right? Now, I think they have massive nutritional benefit to the forest and to the soil. If you think about the it's not even millions, it's literally gazillions of spores that get released in a forest every year. Most of them never grow more mushrooms, but there is absolutely an ecological impact of all of those spores and how they impact the soil and everything else, right? So but let's say that we do have so let's take reishi for example. We have a dead hemlock tree and a few different spores land on it and then they start sending out these little mycelial threads to explore. And we call this host discovery or habitat discovery. So the mycelial threads start exploring and they realize, oh, this is the type of food I can eat this. That's factor number one I need. Factor number two though is there's enough moisture here because mycelium cannot grow if it's too dry. Moisture is one of the most important things for growth. So they're basically exploring, is this edible and is there enough moisture here? And if it is, and another spore has landed and says the same thing, those two spores actually mate with each other. So we call it spore mating and they say, okay, let's do this. We're going to colonize or myceliate this substrate. And the substrate is the tree itself, right? So now that they've decided to do that, that mycelium slowly starts growing under the bark of this dead tree, or maybe the bark's already coming off, but it's inside of the wood of the tree. And this can go on for years without us seeing any visible sign of a mushroom coming out of it, right? So the majority of mycelial growth we never see unless we pull back the bark or take an axe and chop into that dead stump, and then it's full of it, If you start just going in the summertime and just start peeling back the leaf debris, you'll find all these little white threads. Sometimes people think it's mold, but it's not mold. Most of the time, it's mycelium, the white we see in leaf debris, or the white we see when we chop into wood, right? That's the mycelial growth. So once that substrate or that medium or that tree has been myceliated or colonized and it's kind of full, the mushroom says, or the fungi says, okay, it's time for me to reproduce. Now I'm going to start pinning, which is basically creating, like, so basically the mycelium starts getting denser and then it turns into the mushroom, which then releases the spore and the whole cycle repeats itself. So that's the life cycle of fungi and mushroom. We'll next chat about the nutrient needs, and then that gives us the foundational knowledge we need to actually start growing. So, what do fungi need for growth? First off, they need food, and most consume carbon. So, out in nature, it's usually they're eating wood, like dead trees, or they're eating leaves. Now, we have the ability as growers to actually grow on many different substrates. So, we can grow on wood chips, we can grow on sawdust. A fun one is growing on coffee grinds. So, I actually grow oyster mushrooms on old spent coffee grinds. We can grow on straw, we can grow on coconut fiber. There's all kinds of carbon sources that we're actually able to grow saprophytic mushrooms on. Because remember, a saprophytic mushroom is basically eating carbon, which allows us to now grow some of them if we can find an adequate carbon source. The second thing that they need, though, is water. They need high humidity. So this is really, really important. And probably the number one reason that your mushroom project failed, actually, there's two reasons why your mushroom project probably failed. One is it didn't have enough humidity. Two is that it got contaminated by a competing organism, whether that's another fungi or a bacteria. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get to growing. Now, because it needs that high water and because mushrooms actually accumulate and consume things, it is important to know you always want to make sure that you're growing using clean substrate or clean water. Same goes for foraging. You would never want to go and forage mushrooms in like an old industrial site. Or even being careful along the side of an urban road where there's a lot of runoff. If there's any worry of heavy metals, mycelium can actually pull heavy metals out of the soil and out of substrates and bring it all the way up into the mushroom. So mushrooms can actually be high in heavy metals if they're harvested from an environment that's high in heavy metals. Um, so we do need to be careful that we're always foraging in clean environments because they are what we call dynamic accumulators. They can accumulate different toxins and different metals inside of them. Now, of course, if we're doing it in natural substates or in natural environments, there's nothing to worry about there. And then the last two ones there are gas exchange. So they actually, like humans, they breathe in oxygen and then they let out carbon dioxide. So they need adequate gas exchange and they also need light. And that's a common mushroom myth that a lot of people think mushrooms grow in the dark. I used to think mushrooms grew in the dark. Mushrooms do not grow in the dark. Mushrooms need light to grow. And if you think about it, where do we see mushrooms? We see them in the forest. Is it dark in the forest? No, no, there's actually a lot of light. It's diffuse light though. So there aren't really many mushrooms that will grow in full sun. They don't like full sun. They absolutely need diffuse light. So like growing under the canopy of a forest is perfect for growth. Just they're in the shade, but it's not dark. They're able to still photosynthesize through light. So those are the growth requirements of a mushroom. And they have slightly different growth requirements at different stage of their life cycle. So that's why this is really relevant to growing. So let's chat a little bit about how to start growing if you're interested in learning to grow mushrooms at home. So one thing that's becoming pretty common right now is to just go and buy these mushroom blocks. Has anyone seen those before? Where you can just go, like they're becoming quite common. Like I see them at farmers markets and stuff now. Like it seems like almost every town has like their mushroom grower now, which is a new thing. And it's pretty cool. Like I'm pretty stoked about it when I go to a farmer's market. I'm like, oh sweet, there's the person selling the mushroom bags now. So you can go and buy these pre-inoculated blocks, and usually it's sawdust. So the sawdust is the substrate, right? And that company has gone and inoculated it for you with some mycelium of the species they're growing. And you buy that bag, and usually they're like 30 bucks, somewhere between 30 and 40 bucks, I find on average. And you bring that home and you create the right climate at home where there's enough moisture and enough light. And basically, it gives you a flush of mushrooms. And I find that these blocks usually give you between 2 and 4 flushes of mushrooms. So this is a really easy like entry point for learning to grow mushrooms. It's a fun way to start. It's a great way to come into relationship with the fungi itself and the growing, the needs of growing. But here's the thing: if you're actually thinking about like self-sufficiency or self-reliance, or if you want to be a farmer, you're gonna pay $30 for a mushroom grow block, and you're gonna grow maybe $25 in mushrooms out of it. So you're not actually like saving any money doing this over the grocery store, right? This is more something you do for fun. It's something you do for learn. If you're a parent, it's a great thing to do with like a child just to teach them about fungi. So it's great. Um, What I teach people how to do is basically take that mushroom block and then reproduce it many, many times. So I use the mushroom block like a seed, like a bag of seeds, to then grow mushrooms in multiple other different projects. And I can turn that $30 block into thousands of dollars of mushrooms. And that's what I teach people how to do in our courses and stuff. How do you buy the $30 mushroom block and turn it into thousands of dollars of mushrooms, and be able to grow them like kind of indefinitely? So expanding your spawn. What I do, I buy the mushroom blocks, and then in a sterile, clean environment, I take little bits out. So literally, I'll take a tablespoon of that and I'll inoculate other projects. So on the left there, that's actually a 5-gallon bucket. And all of that white is not mold. That's oyster mushroom mycelium growing in there. So I have a process that I go through, and there's a little bit to it. I mean, it's not super scientific, but in essence, I have some straw and I pasteurize it inside of a container. I pasteurize it to kind of kill any bad bacteria that's on there. And then I take that mushroom block and I put a few spoonfuls of it into the straw. I put a cap on it, and now I've got a big 5-gallon bucket full of mycelium that grows on the straw. And what's amazing, remember I mentioned that mushroom block will get like probably 2 to 4 flushes? Well, now my 5-gallon bucket will also get 2 to 4 flushes. But what's awesome is instead of the $30 block getting 2 to 4 flushes, 2 or 3 tablespoons out of the $30 block now gets 3 or 4 flushes. And now I can take 2 or 3 more tablespoons and put it in another bucket and take 2 or 3 more and stick it into some logs. And suddenly, I'm inoculating dozens, if not 100 different projects with that same $30 block. And that's how it turns into thousands of dollars of mushrooms versus $30 of mushrooms from the block. And there is a little bit to that. And, we're not going to really have time to get into the nitty gritty details because there is, yeah, as I said, there is a process to that. But hopefully this kind of gives you the basic idea of how it's done. So you can kind of picture that. Interesting, on the picture on the right there, this is a little bit more of an advanced technique, but those are wine cap mushrooms, King Stropharii mushrooms. And I'm actually literally chopping up the mushrooms into little pieces and I'm rolling them up in cardboard. And I'm actually using the mushrooms to myceliate the cardboard as a substrate. So literally, I chop up the mushrooms really fine. You can't do this with all species of mushrooms. Wine caps are like one of the most aggressive growing myceliums, so it's why I can get away with it. So I basically chop them up into little pieces. I roll it up in wet cardboard, and I put it inside of a bag that's sterile, and the mushroom will basically start. It basically almost like it goes backwards in that cycle. So it went from mycelium into a mushroom, and then it said, "Oh, I'm not able to spore. This jerk over here just cut me up into pieces." Well, since I can't spore, I'm going to turn back into mycelium again, and the mycelium starts eating the cardboard. And now I can take that piece of cardboard, cut it up into little sized pieces, and I can use that to grow more mushrooms. So I literally went from mushroom into more garden beds and more projects. So growing indoors, there's lots of different things you can grow. I always recommend oyster mushrooms as a good starting point because they're one of the easier mushrooms to grow. They're very forgiving. I like to say, a lot of people are really fascinated by mushrooms like lion's mane, hericium, and reishi, and some of these medicinal mushrooms. And with the way I like to say it, with oyster mushrooms, you can do a lot wrong and the mushrooms can still turn out and you get a successful harvest. With lion's mane, you can do a lot right and it still goes wrong. So it's not to discourage you. You absolutely can. But I really recommend starting with oyster mushrooms because they're very forgiving. You can make a lot of mistakes and there's still a decent chance they're going to produce for you. So just to give you a couple examples, that one on the right, there's me growing oysters in coffee grinds, literally out of a mason jar. And those are spent coffee grinds that I've already drank the coffee out of, right? So I'm basically taking the waste product of my coffee and now turning it into mushrooms. Then I harvest the mushrooms, and the waste product of that is this myceliated coffee that I now feed my vermicomposter worms, which now makes the vermicomposter worms, it makes their scat, their poo, more nutrient dense for the worm compost or the vermicompost, and then I give that to my plant starts, right? So you're actually taking a waste product and using it to make other systems in your homestead or setup more robust and yeah, more robust. So anyways, we've got coffee grinds there, the 5-gallon bucket with the oysters. The other one there, those are literally just garden pots. So old garden pots that I've stuffed with straw and inoculated there. So there gives you a couple of different answers. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about indoor growing, and then we're going to chat about outdoors a little bit, and then we're going to transition into foraging. I'm just checking the time, 15 minutes. Yeah, we're doing good for time here. So you do have to, and everybody, please, please, please listen to this part. you have to consider safety when you're going to grow indoors. And there's two parts to that. There's safety of your own health, and there's the safety of your actual home. So mushrooms produce gazillions of spores. You know, maybe not an individual mushroom, but like those little red arrows there are pointing to these little white frosty tendrils coming to the bottom. Those are the mushroom spores, right? We all breathe in spores every single day when we walk in the forest, from spring through fall. So all of us breathe in spores. Our bodies are adapted to breathe in a certain amount of spores. But when we start growing indoors, we're putting a large concentration of spores into an enclosed space with poor airflow. That is not natural. And mushroom spores can make us very sick if we breathe in too much. They can even create very long term health conditions. And there are stories, you know, I don't know too many stories of home growers with this happening, but I've heard a few stories of like professional mushroom growers actually becoming severely allergic to mushrooms and having long term chronic lung issues from breathing in too many spores. And it literally impacts their health for the rest of their life. I've read stories of a few mushroom growers that literally can't go outside when mushrooms are sporing anymore in the local forest because they react so badly to it. Um, you know, they call it like the mushroom flu. They get super super sick from mushroom sporing, which is really sad because it's like pretty hard to go into the forest without breathing in mushroom spores. So you absolutely, and I'm not saying this to scare you off of growing indoors. I grow indoors year round. I'm not at all worried about it impacting my health, but there are precautions that I take to make sure that I'm not breathing in too many of those spores. And one of those is I actually grow most of my projects inside of containers. And the containers actually create the microclimate that keeps that high humidity, but also allows for that oxygen exchange. And it captures the spores there, so I'm not breathing them in and they're not floating around my home. The secondary one, you know, if you live in a house that has high humidity or is susceptible to mold, which a lot of homes are, um, it's not super common because the conditions aren't always perfect. But in theory, and not even theory, in certain conditions, those spores could spread in your home and land in a carpet or land in some dead wood in your home that's a little moist and actually start growing. And you could actually have, and I've heard stories of indoor mushroom growers ending up with like oyster mushrooms growing out of their carpet or growing out of their wall. That is not good. One, that's the health impact is even bigger. Two, you're literally potentially doing structural damage to your home at that point, right? So you do want to know what you're doing if you're going to grow indoors. So let's transition to outdoor growing right now, which is much, much safer. And I want to caveat that with indoor growing is absolutely safe. And it's not even that hard to do it safely. You just got to make sure you are doing something to mitigate against those spores. I grow indoors year round. I don't have a big fancy, I don't have a crazy laboratory and fans and all this set up. Like I'm literally doing it in boxes in the corner of my office, you know? But you just got to make sure that you take that into consideration. My favorite way to grow though is actually outdoors on logs. And we grow more mushrooms than we can possibly eat in a year in an area that's probably like 12 feet wide by about 15 feet long. And honestly, we could probably do it in a 4x4 or a 6x6 space, like grow a year worth of mushrooms if we stack them vertically. You could probably grow a year worth of mushrooms in a 2x2 space in an urban apartment if you stack them vertically because you can constantly cycle them to be flushing. So what's cool about this is you don't need a lot of area to grow a lot of mushrooms. And literally, like Laura and I cannot eat all the mushrooms we grow in the year and then put in what we forage as well. So we give a ton of our mushrooms away to friends and family. Yeah, yeah, we give tons of mushrooms away, and we've used them in our products for Wild Muskoka because we grow way more than we could possibly eat. And I'll tell you, there's nothing else on our homestead where it feels like there's more than we can possibly eat. Everything else we grow is a lot of work to get like just enough to get us through the year or even not enough to get us through the year. And then we end up going to the grocery store for part of the year. Mushrooms would be probably one of the only things we're 100% self-sufficient in now in a relatively small place. And the other thing I love about this from a self-reliance is how little work we actually spend growing mushrooms compared to our other crops. When I think about my tomatoes, like, you know, in the next month, we're going to go and pot up a bunch of pots, plastic pots with soil, and then we're going to put tomato seeds in there. And then they're going to grow, but they're going to grow too fast, and then we're going to repot them. And then we're going to bring them outside, and we're going to repot them again. And then we're going to dig holes, and we're going to put them into the ground, and then they're going to grow really fast, and then we're going to have to prune them, right? And then all the tomatoes come off there, and then we're going to have to take all those things, and some of them aren't going to be ready yet, so we're going to have to dry them green, and then we got to can them. Like, my tomatoes are a lot of work. I don't know if I actually save money growing my own tomatoes. It's a labor of love. It's connection. Yeah, it's like soulful. I don't think it actually saves us money. I might pay more for my own mushrooms, especially if you factor in my labor, than I would if I actually just went to the grocery store. Mushrooms are the other way around. So my mushroom logs are probably like a day and a half of work a year. And one mushroom log will produce anywhere from 6 to 9 years without any more work other than harvesting. So, I don't usually ever spend a day and a half back to back working on just my tomatoes, but like I spend a lot of work on them over the season to get one harvest. My mushrooms, I spend a year and a half in the spring, and that's actually, I don't even have to do it because of what I've done the last 8 years. I've got mushrooms for the next 8 years. So I could actually not do any mushroom work the next 2 years, and I've still got mushrooms for another 8 years right now that are going to come up with zero work. Because when I inoculate the mushrooms into a log, they come back year after year after year, and there's no other work other than harvesting the mushrooms. So that's one of the reasons I think from a self-sufficiency, a self-reliance perspective, and particularly, I don't always like to go down that like darker rabbit hole right now, but like in this current political and infrastructural climate that we're in right now, we all saw in COVID, how fragile our actual food and distribution systems are. Even that big strike that happened on the West Coast to the ports, like it has a major impact on food very quickly across the province or our state, depending on where you're in the States. Sorry, I just have to close something here. How do I get back to full screen? So, if you're somebody that's actually like thinking like, hey, I'm a little bit nervous about, the infrastructure of our global food systems right now, and even like the supply chain infrastructure and how many different things could potentially disrupt that. And you're like, I really believe that we need to produce more food locally, and you want to produce at least a percentage of that yourself. I would argue that mushrooms are probably one of the best things that you could start growing to take like a leap forward in that food self-reliance, especially when you think about how much they provide us for as far as food, medicine, and nutrient dense food. So I'll finish my sermon there about why mushrooms are so good and get back to growing. So there's a few different techniques that I grow with. The picture on the right there, those are the shiitake mushrooms, and they're growing inside of logs. So we're doing this in hardwood logs, not coniferous trees. They have to be hardwood logs. And the logs do need to be cut fresh, green. So probably one of the most common questions that I get from folks is, oh, a tree fell over in my backyard last summer. Can I go and inoculate with mushrooms? No, you can't. Um, because that tree has already been infected with other mushrooms. The fact that it fell over probably meant that there was other mycelium in it already. So you do need to cut green wood. And then you inoculate it with one of those mushroom grow kits. And then you basically let it rest. And within 12 to 24 months, depending on the type of mushroom and the environment, you have a log that starts producing mushrooms, and it can produce anywhere from 6 to 9 years. That one on the left there, those are actually oyster mushrooms, and they're growing in this technique called a stacked tower. One other technique is growing in garden beds. So this is that King Spiraea mushroom again here, or wine caps. And you'll notice this one is literally growing in our pumpkin squash bed. So why not maximize how much yield you're getting out of the same space? So we literally grow wine caps in the understory of our blueberry bushes. We grow it underneath our squash plants. We grow it underneath our fruit trees on the homestead. So we're just maximizing yield. And I really believe that the wine caps actually increase the yield of the other plants in the way that they help build the soil for the other plants as well. So it really is a symbiotic relationship and a win-win. So we've chatted a lot about why to grow. I'm realizing I've got 5 minutes before the hour, so this next piece will probably take me 10 minutes. So we may be a few minutes longer than I thought. So just to give people a heads up there. Yeah, usually I'm wrapping up the foraging piece by now, but we did a little bit of a longer intro there with Kareen and I going back and forth, which was fun. So anyways, just letting folks know we'll be probably another 10 minutes here, and then we'll kind of transition into the Q&A stuff. Before I go into the foraging, I did just want to mention to folks that if you're interested in learning how to grow mushrooms at home, and you're interested in the identification of the foraging, I do have a very in-depth online mushroom growing course. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. Laura and I started building this a few years ago. It's a work in progress. And I say work in progress, like it's a complete package with a ton of stuff already. But every year we're adding new stuff to it. As our skill set and knowledge grows, we're adding new and new lessons and videos. So it's a go at your own pace course. Everything's pre-recorded. There is a community for you to ask myself and Laura your questions in, though. And I do live events inside of the course once in a while. So I'll bring in guest instructors and we'll do like deep dives, kind of like Kareen and I am, but they're only for people that are inside the paid course. And really, the course's aim is to help you save money and basically teach you how to grow a year worth of mushrooms at home. And if you actually dive in and utilize this, like you can grow way more mushrooms than you'll pay for the course in less than a year, like guaranteed, with the techniques in the course there. Probably the most useful thing out of it, though, is helping you avoid the common mistakes. I've been doing this for almost 20 years right now. And definitely when I started growing mushrooms, I had a lot of stuff go wrong and a lot of projects that didn't work. So in the course, I do detailed videos with common problems showing you how to prevent them from happening. And if you're still struggling, you can ask me, be like, hey, Chris, like I'm having this issue. I keep getting green mold, or my mushrooms keep growing super skinny, or hey, I found this mushroom in the wild. What is it? Can you help me identify this? So we can answer those questions for you. And ultimately, we want you to be confident and safe when you're growing and foraging in the outdoors, feel the benefits of working with medicinal mushrooms in your life, and be able to grow them. So that's what we set it up to do. And we teach indoor and outdoor growing techniques in the course. We teach you small scale setups for like literally like an urban apartment, right to like larger homestead setups where you could grow in abundance. Interesting enough, I'm going to be interviewing someone inside of the course. One of my course students a number of years ago now runs a mushroom growing business, and they're making their full-time income growing mushrooms and selling them. And they started inside my mushroom growing course. I actually just found this out like this a couple of months ago. So I'm bringing them in as a guest now inside of the course for the students to basically interview them and say, hey, how did you go from like taking this course to literally making money? So we're going to do a whole class on like scaling the mushroom process. And I'm going to interview a past student. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then, yeah, the course basically supports you with like kind of working through all the logistics. Where do you source materials? Where would be the best place to do it on my property or in my house? And then probably one of the funnest parts of it. So my wife, Laura, she leads mushroom walks, like edible foraging walks. And inevitably coming out of the day, people are like, there was so much information there. I've forgotten 90% of it already. So we basically have recorded Laura going around to all these mushrooms she does on the walks. And it's the close up of her going over all the key points. So even if you go on a mushroom walk in person, it's still a fantastic resource because you can go back and review that information with Laura. So we call that the virtual mushroom walk. So that's what's included in the course. And we do have a 25% off offer right now for anyone that's here and part of the Spiraea Herbs, Kareen's newsletter. So coupon code Spiraea25 will get you 25% off the course. And the link is themushroomcourse.com. I wonder if Kareen, you couldn't even throw that in the chat quick. So if you want to Kareen will throw that in there. Spiraea25 is the thing. And I'll just mention the coupon code SPOT is a little bit hidden on the course. So just double check that you get it in the right place. That's why I made that little diagram there. So at the very top, once you've hit join, you'll see the mushroom course, and then there'll be like your contact information. And there's this little line, and unfortunately it won't allow me to make it any bigger, that says have a coupon code. So make sure you click on that, enter it, and then scroll down to the bottom and double check that it actually applied the coupon to your checkout there. So there's a little tip there. So I'm gonna leave it there, and let's dive into foraging next, and then we'll do the Q&A to finish us off. And yeah, thank you folks for letting me share that too, sincerely. I offered to do this for free. I sincerely do. I do all kinds of stuff for free. I do really believe in sharing this stuff, but it also is supportive to me to be able to let you know what my paid offerings, because that's what allows me to come on and deliver something like that tonight. So thank you for letting me share that with you. All right, I'm gonna have a little sip of water, and let me see. Perfect. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can go through this in under 10 minutes and then jump into the Q&A. So intro to safe and sustainable wild foraging. I don't need to touch on that bottom part. Hopefully everyone already gets this idea that it's actually not just about what can I take, it's actually about building relationships with the plants and fungus, and it's a lifelong journey of learning. So I'm going to share basically 5 tips for getting started in foraging here. And my first tip is don't be the can I eat it person. And this is going to start with another rant and a pet peeve. I'm going to try not to get upset right now. But oh my goodness, it drives me nuts when I go on a mushroom group on Facebook and somebody has a picture of a mushroom and they're saying, hey, can I eat this? And I'm like, oh my goodness, you're going to trust your life to Facebook mob to tell you if this is edible or not. And the number of times I've seen people confidently misidentify mushrooms on Facebook groups and say, oh, yes, 100% it's this, and they're 100% wrong. It's 100% not that. Happens all the time. So please, and I'm not saying absolutely, if you're in a Facebook group and you want to get people's thoughts on the ID, absolutely go in there, post them. But don't be like, can I eat this Facebook? You can say, hey, does anyone want to help me identify that? That's a great question. Can I eat this Facebook? That's a very bad question to ask. Okay. So nobody should be asking Facebook to eat them. You also should not be asking your mushroom phone app if I can eat it. Could it be one tool that you're using? Absolutely. To take a picture with the app that tells you it's this mushroom and then the app says it's edible, great. That's one piece of information supporting a hypothesis that you are forming that might be the mushroom you think it is. But those apps are wrong all the time too. So I really encourage people, I get that eating mushrooms is the sexy part, it's the fun part, but most of the mushrooms that I confidently eat, I studied them and looked at them for years before I put them into my mouth. And I'll be straight up honest, I'm the grower in our family. Laura is the forager. So I've really gone down the rabbit hole with the growing techniques. And when Laura teaches her courses, I actually come in and teach the growing stuff. Laura knows so many more mushrooms than I do and is way better at it than I am. I probably know more than, a lot of people about foraging mushrooms and edible ones, but there's a lot of mushrooms that I won't even trust myself to harvest. If Laura picks it, I'm like, good, I'll eat it. But I'm not actually even there myself, even though I've kind of been knowing them for a while, because there's just so much to it. And here's the thing, I don't want to scare you off it, but there are a lot, I should say even a lot. There are a number of mushrooms that are very toxic or deadly. And a number of those have mushrooms that are edible that look very, very similar. And there's quite a bit to knowing the difference between the two. So you need to be so, so confident with your answer. And that's why I say you're not going to get that confidence from watching this with me. You're not even going to get it from signing up for my online course. We're going to teach you a whole bunch of mushrooms in the course, edible ones that you can forage down the road. But what we teach in the course is like, hey, here is all the key things. Go out and meet it in nature. And then look at your app. And did the app say the same thing as Chris and Laura did? And then pull out a book. Did the book say the same thing as us? Go on a walk with somebody that knows their mushrooms. Like we always ask people to have like 3 or 4 different reference points for that mushroom and to be able to prove it beyond a doubt that that's your mushroom before you ever consider consuming it, because literally your life is on the line. Not scaring you or trying to scare. Well, I am trying to scare you, honestly. I'm scaring you to be safe. I don't want to scare you from foraging though, because you absolutely can develop the confidence to forage mushrooms. And the whole point of the don't be the eat it person comment is just to encourage you to slow down. Focus a little less on what can I eat and a little more on just building relationship with the fungi, understanding the key ID features starting. And over time, you will develop the confidence to harvest things and eat them or harvest them and use them for mushrooms. And I am going to end with some of the safer mushrooms. There are some safer groups of mushrooms to start with. There's riskier groups and there's safer groups. So the next piece of advice, before you worry about is it edible or not, is just learn the different parts of the mushrooms, right? And we're not going to really break this down right now. But, for example, down at the bottom there, they have that part that they call it the vulva of the mushroom, that little ball. Like looking at that part of the mushroom is one of the ways that you determine certain species apart. That next thing up there, there's a ring skirt. That's a key ID feature. What's underneath the cap is a key ID feature, right? So really get to know those different parts of the mushrooms as a foundational starting point. And here's an example of those parts, gills versus ridges. 2 of these mushrooms have gills. 1 of them has ridges. Do you know the difference between a gill and a ridge? If you do not, you should absolutely not harvest any mushrooms that have gills. Because a huge portion of our edible mushrooms are gilled mushrooms. But some of the most poisonous mushrooms are also gilled mushrooms. So that top left mushroom is Amanita mushroom. If eaten in too high a quantity, is deadly, right? The other 2 are chanterelles and oysters, absolute delicacies. But you need to know the chanterelle is not actually a ridge. It's not a gill. It's a ridge. And if you don't know why I'm saying that orange mushroom has a ridge and why I'm saying the white one has a gill, then you're not actually ready to harvest gilled mushrooms yet. You shouldn't be harvesting oysters or chanterelles from the forest if you can't answer that question. And a bunch of other questions. Now, you could grow oyster mushrooms on a log and be very confident because you know it's an oyster because you inoculated it with oyster mycelium, which is why growing them is a really great starting point, right? Okay. Um, the 5 rights of harvesting. This is a really important one with getting started. So making sure that it's in the right place. And this is both, I talked about this from an identification perspective, right? So being in the right habitat might actually be one of the ID features to know it's the right mushroom. Right place also means that you're harvesting from a clean and habitat as well. And you're not worried about the bioaccumulation of toxins within that mushroom. The right plant, obviously, is just making sure you have the right mushroom as well. The right part, that's a little bit more for plants than mushrooms. Um, right season is really, really important. Almost every mushroom that we forage has a season it grows in. And if you find a mushroom that you're like, oh, I think this is the whatever mushroom, but it's not growing in the right season, there's a good chance it's not actually the mushroom you think it is. So you actually need to know what time of year do the mushrooms grow. That's part of the way that you identify them. So right season is actually important for ID. And then, of course, right preparation. Most mushrooms are not good to consume raw. Um, you can consume most plants raw, not all. Most plants you can consume raw. Um, most mushrooms, your belly will probably not like it if you consume them raw. So you do need to know how to prepare them right. Um, so here's a great example of an ID trick here. So that picture on the left there is a type of puffball mushroom. They're like a little mini puffball mushroom there with those those little dots on it. Look at that picture on the right there. Do you see that little white round ball? It looks very similar to the puffball. And in fact, there's another type of puffball that's actually smooth like that. They look like little eggs on the ground. But that little white egg on the right that also has the stalk behind it is actually a destroying angel mushroom that has not opened up yet. Destroying angel is a deadly toxic mushroom. But in its early stage of growth, it looks incredibly similar to the puffball. The puffball is a delicious edible. The destroying angel will kill you. And in that stage of growth, especially to an untrained eye, look incredibly similar. Now, the thing is, if you pick that destroying angel and you cut it down the center and fold it in half, you would actually notice that inside of it, I think, do I have another picture? Oh, yeah, here we go. So that other one up there on the left is called an earth ball mushroom with that little purple in there. So that's not really considered an edible either, or it's not considered an edible. But if I cut that puff ball in half, it's going to look kind of like that earth ball, where it just looks like a marshmallow in the middle. Now, the earth ball has that purple. So if you see that purple, you're not eating it. If it has that really nice, smooth consistency like a marshmallow through the middle of it, that would be one piece of information suggesting or supporting my hypothesis that this is an edible puffball. If I cut it open and it's like, oh, wow, I can actually see the stem growing through the middle and there's some airspace, and this is actually just a little ball that hasn't opened up yet, it could be the destroying angel, which is deadly, poisonous, right? So these are the kind of intricacies you need to learn if you're going to start foraging mushrooms safely. Um, so there's all kinds of different patterns for how to grow. This is actually one of the activities inside of the online course. So we send you out on a mushroom scavenger hunt and basically learn to identify these different fruiting structures: gills, pores, tooth, coral, sac, shelf, jelly slime, puffballs. So we have a really in-depth lesson on the course on what these 8 different things are and how to identify them in the wild. And there's really detailed videos of Laura explaining each one of these groups and how to go find them. And then you literally print out the sheet and you go into nature on a scavenger hunt to find all 8 of them to develop your brain patterning to be able to confidently know the difference between a gill and a ridge, like we talked about a moment ago. Whoop. So just to quickly go through, here's some example of like some tooth mushrooms at the top. The bottom one there would be more of like a coral mushroom, the orange one. There's an example of a mushroom that has pores, not gills on the bottom, right? Um, the one on the left here is what we call a sac mushroom. So that's a morel, a common edible, versus the one on the right there is what we call a shelf mushroom, growing off of a tree. Here's the puffball and friends kind of group here. Yeah, so there that kind of goes through some of the different ones. So here's like one of the last tips I'm going to share you. I've got 2 tips left, and then we're actually going to go into the Q&A session in here a moment, which actually we're perfect on time, 8:10 after, so that worked out pretty well. So shelf funguses are one of the safer groups to start with. And I'm not saying you can just go out and start harvesting any shelf funguses. And the shelf funguses aren't usually edible mushrooms. Like we don't eat reishi mushroom, but reishi is a highly medicinal mushroom. If you don't know much about that, maybe that's a homework assignment to start looking into all of the clinical studies on reishi and its medicinal efforts. But there are many very medicinal shelf mushrooms, and they're one of the more safer groups to start with when you're learning how to forage. So they're a good place to start with. The other one is this group called boletes. And that picture on the right there is a type of bolete mushroom. And they're generally thought to be, especially in Canada and the United States, one of the safer groups to start with. There's a couple that you don't want to eat, but like most of them, you can eat safely. So boletes and shelf fungus are really good starting points in your journey to become a forager. Still not saying go eat them right away. You still have some learning to do, but they're a great starting point, and you'll probably get to the confidence level to start harvesting them much faster than you would with a gill mushroom, which might take you years before you're confident harvesting a gill mushroom in the wild. Yeah, so remember, avoid gills when you're learning to forage. A lot of our most deadly mushrooms have gills. And then the last tip, of course, is finding a mentor to work with. Use your apps, use your books, come to events like this. But really, I highly recommend you actually get into the woods with somebody that knows mushrooms at some point in your journey. You know, up in Muskoka here, we do walk. So if you're interested, reach out to Wild Muskoka. You know, we do mushroom foraging walks if you happen to be in Ontario. But, you know, many areas have like local mycological societies. You know, the big city south of me, Toronto, like I know there's a Toronto Mycological Society and they organize regular mushroom walks. So if you don't live close enough to myself and Laura to come out with us, you know, figure out where your local mycology society is, or just do some searches. And you might find somebody doing mushroom walks in your area. I do find they're becoming a little more common. One of my favorite books is called Mushrooming Without Fear. It's a really great one to learn some of the foundations. And of course, I have the mushroom course that I already mentioned to you guys. And with the mushroom course, you know, we do go really in depth into the identification component of it, and helping you basically develop you know, what types of questions do I need to ask? How do I start to form my hypothesis? How do I support it to lead me towards this being the mushroom I think it is, which eventually leads me towards being able to eat it? So the mushroom course, if you sign up, you get lifetime access. So as long as the course exists, you get to come in for one price point. And you can save 25% off right now with the Spiraea 25 coupon code. I am in the process of planning a bunch of classes like this that are only for people that are paid members, where we're going to go way deeper into some of these topics. I'm going to do a workshop all on spring foraging, and we're basically going to talk about like what mushrooms are coming up this spring. And it'll be a live class. Laura's going to come in for it. You can ask your questions, you know. I'm doing another one soon on how to cut your mushroom logs. But that'll just be for people that are inside of the course. They'll get to attend, and I'll talk about how do you cut your mushroom logs and prepare them for the upcoming growing season. So those are some of the things inside of the course. And that pretty much concludes my conversation. We are going to do a Q&A in a moment here. But I'll just kind of end in case anybody needs to roll out early. I want to just thank you for showing up with me tonight. I hope you found this workshop inspiring and educational. I hope that, you know, you're appreciating the part around, you know, not just being a taker, but coming into relationship with these beings, and how important they are in the ecosystem, and that you're feeling the gratitude for how much they actually provide for us in food and medicine, as well as how much they provide for the earth. So thank you for sitting with me. I'm truly passionate about this stuff. I love sharing about it. And if some of you decide to join me inside of this course, I'm so excited to go deeper with you as a mentor. You'll get to meet my wife, Laura, inside of the course, who, as I said, is really the forager in our family. And I'll leave it there. So I'm going to pass it back to Kareen for a second. And then if you have questions about either the course or stuff we talked about tonight, you know, we'll stick around another maybe 10-ish minutes here to answer some questions. Oh my goodness, 82 messages in the chat. That's an active chat. That's awesome.
It has been an active chat, and I've got a good list of questions for you, Chris. But first, I want to say, holy moly, it's so funny because I was just talking with Paul about how we want to scale back. No, I'm gonna like leave this room and be like, so babe, I think you know that scale back talk that we had about the homestead? We might be growing some mushrooms. That was absolutely amazing. And like the chat, people were talking about it. Like you're just a wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. It's been such a pleasure. Okay, are you ready?
Let's
There's
do it.
questions.
Rapid fire.
All right. Okay. So the first one actually came to me via email because she knew she wasn't going to be able to make it tonight. Is there any truth to the information that people who have had exposure to household mold and are dealing with any level of potential mold toxicity should completely avoid using mushrooms?
Hmm. I can't. I'm gonna not answer that one because I would only be speculating. It's above my pay grade. Sorry.
Honestly, I feel like that's a depends question. Like when I got that too, and even from a health practitioner standpoint, I'm like,
Mhm.
there's so much more that we don't know about the health condition, right? So I just
Yeah.
wanted to bring it to the table because she did want me to ask, but
Yeah, and maybe the one thing I'd say, I bet you it's not quite that simple. And I would imagine there's some cases where mushrooms might actually even be supportive, certain mushrooms, and other people or certain species that they should avoid or situations. So I would want to know a lot more about the condition as well, which is
yeah,
why I'm hesitant to really say anything there.
agreed. All right. So one question was, do all species of Ganoderma or Ganoderma only grow on hemlock specifically, or do different species
Mhm.
of Ganoderma, i.e. reishi, grow on different types of trees?
Yeah, awesome. So we have a few different species of Ganoderma here in North America, but there's many across the globe. So our main two here are probably Ganoderma tsuge, which grows on the hemlock trees, and I think it's artist conch is a Ganoderma species as well.
Yeah,
Um,
lucidum, right? Ganoderma lucidum.
no, Lucidium is not the artist conch. That's a different one altogether.
Oh,
Lu-
that's
Lucidium is the one that so
there's
Lucidium does
polypore.
yeah, Lucidium does actually grow in North America as well, but that's actually the one that grows over in Asia. That's really well, like Lucidium is probably one of the most well-studied reishi mushrooms for its medicine properties. It's been used for thousands of years, maybe even tens of thousands of years over in Asia as a medicine. It does grow here, and it actually will grow on hardwoods here, but it's much more rare. And then we have the artist conch, which I can't remember the Latin name. It's a type of Ganoderma, but of course it grows on hardwoods. Oh, there, Jane just threw it in. Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. I can't even pronounce it. Applanatum. Applanatum. Thanks, Jane, for throwing that one in. But yes, there's many species of Ganoderma mushrooms. Tsuge is probably one of the more common ones we have here, and the Tsuge is more specific to or is specific to hemlocks. So
Cool. This was not a question, but I actually wanted to share it in the group in case anyone didn't see it. There, Patty was talking about they're now using fungi to clean up oil spills and remove plastics in the ocean. And they're even they found that fungi are beginning to eat and absorb radioactive waste in Chernobyl. Like, how
yeah,
cool.
that's a whole another topic we dive into this realm of mycoremediation and
Yeah.
using mushrooms to clean up damaged environments. If anyone is interested in that, there's a book called Earth Repair by Lila Darwish. She's a friend of mine, and she's done a lot of study into that. And actually, she's one of the people I'm trying to book as a guest to come into the course. So I'm hoping we're actually going to do a whole night on bioremediation inside of the course if I can get Lila. She's super busy. But I'm trying to sell her on coming in to do a presentation for folks inside the course.
Okay, so there was a question about coffee grounds as well, asking would it be wise to source organic coffee and to also go through a coffee company that is testing for mold if you're going to be using the spent grounds as a medium for growth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I think there's an argument that to probably only be drinking organic coffee in the first place. Although that's a personal choice. So, and if you're drinking a non-organic coffee, then you're probably not getting anything more from eating the mushrooms out of it than you would be from drinking it anyways, would be my opinion on that. So if you're drinking a non-organic coffee, then you could probably drink grow mushrooms out of it. If you're somebody that's concerned about drinking a non-organic mushroom and you're going to drink organic coffee, then yeah, that would be my first choice. I don't buy my coffee from places that are verified with the mold certification. I am aware of that. I've read about it. I'm not. So from a contamination perspective, that has not been a problem for me. So the coffees that I drink have not been tested for mold. They are organic and fair trade, and it has not had any issue with the success of me growing on them.
Good to know. Thank you. So one person was asking, so if mushrooms can remove heavy metals from the earth, can they then help remove heavy metals from the body?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's like a big it's not just as simple as like take this mushroom and it will remove the heavy metals from your body. It's like herbs, without going down the rabbit hole. And really this is Crean's specialty and what she does inside of her membership, I believe, and a lot of her teachings. But people often like to look to herbs and mushrooms the same way we look to Western medicine, and they don't work quite in the same way. There's this much more holistic approach that we need to take with them. And I'm very hesitant to even ever say like this mushroom does this herb does this. And it's not to say that they don't, but it's just a little bit more complex. So yes, mushrooms can be supportive to removing heavy metals in our body, but that's a whole class, or even like that's many classes of diving into that.
It is. And it's like, I think it's the maybe one of the biggest pet peeves that people in my membership have. I'm like, well, it depends. And they're like, ugh, and then because there is no straight answer, because just like when you're developing relationship, when you're using plants medicinally, that plant now has a relationship with your body, right? And your body is its own unique ecosystem. So how can we say for certain that that mushroom is going to interact with my body the same way it does with yours, right? So it's complicated. Okay, we have a few more. So one person, I think it was a question that was referring to one of your photos where you were using straw as a medium.
Hmm.
And the person was asking, why does the straw have to be so clean?
Competing fungus and molds. So and so here's an example. I'm not so worried about growing on the coffee. I have a bit of concern about growing on non-organic straw because of what often wheat crops are sprayed with. And I've done a ton of research, and I haven't really been able to find any clear scientific data on growing mushrooms on, say, straw that's been sprayed with Roundup. Now, there are some people that make the argument that the mushrooms actually help break down some of those pesticides and chemicals into a simpler compound that's actually less absorbable and toxic to us. So we just talked about mushrooms and bioremediation. So people have made the argument that actually the mushrooms make it even safer to come off of that in the fact that they grow. I have not found the scientific studies to back that up. So when I first started growing, I was just growing on whatever straw from the garden center. So probably non-organic, which means probably it's been sprayed with Roundup. I've eaten a bunch of mushrooms growing off of straw that probably was sprayed. Now I did age the straw for a period of time. Now I've switched over to sourcing organic straw for my mushroom growing. It's expensive, like a lot more expensive. That's why I grew on the old straw for a while. But because I'm consuming it and I haven't been able to find the scientific study to show that it's breaking down those chemicals or pesticides in a way that my body doesn't absorb it, until I can find that study, I'm leaning now towards actually growing on organic straw. But yes, the straw. So the straw needs to be dry. It couldn't have. It You can't have straw that sat outside and been rained on or got moist, because as soon as that straw gets moist, that's when bacteria and other mycelium get into it. So I need clean, dry straw, and I need to treat it on top of that. Which is the that's what I teach inside the course. How do you actually pasteurize that straw? And there's a bit of a process I go through there. Although it's not rocket science. I'm not a rocket scientist.
So one person, I think this was a mushroom kit, and they were saying, so my lion's mane was doing awesome. Unfortunately, it developed some mold. Can I still save it?
Yeah, so I guess it kind of depends how bad it like. So if it started growing a mushroom and then you got some mold on the mushroom, but there's not mold growing into the kit, you might be able to just cut it off and get another flush, and it might be fine. You may be able to, if there's a little bit even growing in the bag, you may be able to scrape some of it off. I mean, the important thing is you don't want mold on the part that you're consuming into your body, and then mold, produce spores and stuff like that too. So you want to just make sure it's been cleaned well. So you might be able to save it. Usually once mold starts, it's not a good thing, but you may be able to save it.
Okay, good to know. There you go, Andrea. You might be able to save it.
Yeah, and you could cut. I would cut it off, Andrea, and see what it does. And you may get away with it. You may not.
Yeah. Okay, so one person, I would like to know the average time it takes for the mushrooms to fruit after you inoculate them. And she said, I'm getting ready to do turkey tail, lion's mane, and chicken of the woods.
Yeah, so it depends on the species, which she just named, and it depends on the substrate that you're growing on. So, for
Yeah.
example, like when I'm growing on logs, oysters, which are a very fast growing mycelium, I'll inoculate logs in the springtime, and sometimes they're fruiting by that fall. My shiitake logs, sometimes it takes 2 years before they fruit, like literally uh, 24 months before I get my first flush. But the difference is the oyster log that fruited the same year only fruits for like 3 or 4 years, and then it's spent and done. That shiitake log, 8, 9 years later, might still be giving you mushrooms. I'm guessing the person that just asked that question might be talking about indoors growing. So again, each one of those species is going to be a little bit different, but usually it takes like about 8 weeks for it to colonize the substrate, and then you're by like into that like 10 to 12 weeks, you're getting into fruiting there. So it is quite quick turnover growing indoors, but it does depend a little bit on the growing environments, the temperature, the species, and the substrate. So all of those things will impact how long it takes. But indoor growing is usually pretty quick. I mean, oysters, you might even get fruit within 8 weeks from like inoculation to harvest 8 weeks. If everything's perfect. More realistically, you're probably looking like 10 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that.
Hi,
Well,
Chris. This is Patty Wright. That was me that asked that question. I was actually talking about outdoors
Okay.
with the plugs, and this is my first attempt at doing the outdoor plugs. I did do a couple of beds this last fall,
Yeah,
and I'm
perfect.
hoping that things will come up there. But what we had is we actually had a tornado come through in August, and it literally took out 20, 30 trees out of our yard. So trying to get ahead of that, we went ahead and cut up the logs and the right type, right sizes and things like that, and have them all stacked and ready. But we didn't inoculate them last fall because we were going into winter. Do you think those
Mm.
that is that tree too dry, or is it still safe to inoculate them?
So probably, so here's a couple things. What I would have done is I would have inoculated them right away. Or if I wasn't going to, I would have actually left them whole because they're the trees whole until, which you might not have been able to because of the mess. I totally get
No, they
that
were
part. But
on our house, so
yeah. So that wasn't really a choice. But theoretically, ideal scenario, if I'm not going to inoculate it right away, I'd leave it whole, which means there's less spots for a competing mycelium to get in, and it's going to hold more moisture. As soon as I cut it, moisture's escaping, and I'm creating entry points for stuff to get in. Because it just came down last fall, my thought is that the wood will still be good for growing mushrooms. The worry is, did it get contaminated in the meantime? Because like you could take that log and especially if they're buried under the snow, well, they're gonna get re-soaked as it melts out. If they're not, you could literally throw it in a creek or a puddle overnight, which rehydrates it. So the moisture issue is probably still okay. My concern would just be, is it already been contaminated by other stuff in the environment? And it wouldn't hurt to inoculate some and just see what happens, but you are in a little bit of a higher risk zone there. The more you can stack in your favor, especially with like again, oyster mushrooms are so fast growing that they can often outcompete other things. The lion's mane, the turkey tail. I don't have experience with the chicken of the woods, but the lion's mane and the turkey tail is actually a very aggressive one. So turkey tail will grow faster, probably less likely to be taken over by competing stuff. Honestly, my problem is I often lose my shiitake logs to turkey tail, which is great because the turkey tail is medicinal, but it's not great because I can go and harvest turkey tail everywhere else in the woods. I wanted shiitakes, right? The turkey tail probably has the highest success out of those. The reishi and the chicken of the woods is probably going to be higher risk. Those logs might already have native turkey tail or other things in them. Does that kind of answer your question?
it does. And my plan was actually to do the inoculate with the dowel rods, actually
Yeah,
drilling and putting the dowel rods
yeah.
in. But my first attempt, so we'll see how it works.
Yeah, and you know what might be interesting to do is if you have the ability to cut like one or two smaller saplings or even take some branches off of some trees, it would be interesting to inoculate both side by side, and
Sure.
see if they both are successful or if just the new ones that cut in the spring were successful, right?
I like it. You just added to my husband's honeydew list.
Perfect. Honey, do this. Yeah. So much of how I've learned has been through experimentation, right? And just like, oh, here's an idea, and let's try these two things side by side and see what works. So that's what I would do in your case. I would inoculate some of the ones from last year, but I'd also inoculate some green stuff in case the ones from last year don't work. But the new stuff does. And then you're learning either way and you're increasing your odds.
Perfect. Thank you.
that is awesome. Okay, there's just a few more because I know it's getting late. One person was talking about they absolutely have to grow them outside. Only concern is about animals eating them. So, what are your thoughts on animals coming and eating all your mushrooms?
It is a thing. Um, Yeah, hold on a second here. I'm just grabbing a link here. Yeah, so depending on where you live, it is a thing. We haven't had many issues with like squirrels and stuff like that around our mushrooms. I know some people that have. I know some people that net their mushrooms to keep animals off them. Now we have deer and stuff walking through, and like that's really not been a problem for me. I have heard of squirrels being a big issue. So it's like when you have a blueberry patch that's really good, and same with us. Like we don't seem to be able to have to net our blueberries. Like we seem to be able to get enough off them. Some people, it's like I would never get a blueberry, so they've built nets over them. So you may want to consider netting them for wildlife if it's a problem where you are. The other one that the worry is slugs, right? Can be a big one. And I find a couple things for slugs. One of them is the cleaner you keep the area around them, the less likely the slugs are. So I always go and leaf blow around my mushroom logs, and I found that keeps them back a little bit. Um, yeah, and I also find depending on the year, like years when there's a lot of moisture, I have more slug problems. Drier years, I tend to have less slug problems. So there's a bit to working with the slugs and animals, but it is like it is real, just like it is when you have a vegetable garden. And sometimes you need to figure out how to adapt to your unique environment and what your problem is.
Very, very true. Okay, so Lisa was asking, I have dead man's fingers growing in my
Oh
backyard
yeah,
garden. So she was just very curious about this strain. What do you know about
yeah. I don't know a lot about them. That would be a great question for Laura. I know the species. We have them growing around here as well. I don't know that I can tell you anything too exciting about them. My wife Laura might have some more info about them. But sorry, Lisa, not a very exciting answer for you. I can't really say too much other than they look pretty cool. I don't actually know a lot about that species.
I'm gonna have to Google them to see what they look like. So one person was asking specific question about your course and if your students are from the US, like is there any issues if they're from the United States and there's different mushroom availability?
Oh no, a huge percentage of the people in the course are from the U.S. The one thing in the U.S., we're gonna span over some different ecosystems. So people that are in like the only area in the U.S. that I would say you might get less out of it if you're in a very dry area, like if you literally live in like the Tucson desert. You could still do the indoor growing part of the course, absolutely. The outdoor growing is going to be tougher, and the ID section is going to be less. But like it's relevant to most of the U.S. And if your climatic conditions are a little bit different, or your species are even a bit different than what we have, that's where the online community comes in because I'll help you adapt. I teach the principles in the course. I can work with you to apply them to your unique situation and ecosystem inside of the course community. So I do that with folks all the time, help them adapt what we're doing to their unique setup and their ecosystem. As far as the identification, though, a lot of the mushrooms that we cover in the course are ones that actually grow across a large swath of North America as well.
That is awesome. Okay, there's just a couple more in the chat. Um, One person was asking, are the same practices in play for the medicinal group of psilocybin, or is that a completely different ballgame?
Yeah, no, it's a little bit different with psilocybin. I mean, the principles are very similar, and there is some overlap, but the technique is a little bit. Yeah, there are some different specifics with psilocybin. I've never actually grown them, although I've had a tour of a setup and I've seen how people grow them. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in it, and it is a little different.
Okay. And this question I've always had a curiosity on. Are there, in your mind, is there a difference medicinally between, like, say, cultivated or naturally grown, say, like cordyceps? Do you think there'd
Yeah,
be different medicinal properties?
yeah, that's a super interesting one. I would like to see. I've got some thoughts, but I would like to see the actual scientific studies. Without having the laboratory. If I won $1 gazillion, like I would start a lab and do all kinds of super nerdy testing. Um, so my thought is, so particularly like if you're growing outdoors on wood, I would be very surprised if there's too much of a difference, right? Because they're sourcing so much of their nutrients. Like when I grow shiitakes, I'm growing them on logs from the forest. So they're sourcing from the same wood that the wild mushrooms are coming from.
Yeah.
Um, Growing oysters on a log versus straw, that would be an interesting one, where I could maybe see there being a bit of a difference. Because the straw is just there's less nutrient density in that straw than there is on that log from the forest, right? Now, I'm inclined to believe that you're still going to have some nutrient value from growing them in any place, probably even significant. Um, but it really comes down to, I think, the quality of the substrate. It's the same with veggies. Like lettuce growing in a nice organic garden that has really healthy soil is not the same as lettuce growing hydroponically. But lettuce growing hydroponically is still better than no lettuce at all.
Agreed.
So
Agreed. Yeah, I think that is probably the answer I would have given as well, right? We come back to it depends. That same answer. Okay, there's just a like one or two more. The best way to get rid of bugs before preparing mushrooms.
I'm just responding to somebody in the chat here, and then I'll answer
Oh,
those.
okay, yeah, no worries.
Sorry, can you read that again?
The best way to get rid of bugs before preparing mushrooms.
You mean to preparing to grow them, or
That's
is
what
that
my
what you?
question was, preparing to grow or preparing to harvest. So, Lisa, if you're still here, Lisa H, drop that in there. And then preparing to eat. So like,
Oh, yeah, yeah. So when we grow outdoors, I mean, the oyster mushrooms, I forget what they're called. There's this little like black and orange bug that often gets on the oyster mushrooms. but they come off really easy. Like I literally just cut them off, and I have a little knife, and then I literally just tap the top of it a couple times, and they just fall right out. It's not really a big deal there. Same with things like, sometimes we'll get some slugs on the shiitakes, and it's just a matter of just like flicking them off with a knife. Now we have chickens, so often I'll even harvest the shiitakes or the oysters with the bugs on them into a basket, and then I'll take them over to the chicken pen and I'll knock them off there, and now that's chicken food, right? So, but there's no those bugs, as much as they might make us feel off, they don't change. Like there's no problem eating the mushrooms after they've had a slug on it or a bug on them. So
I think it's the same when you're harvesting from your vegetable garden, right? Like if I turned down every piece of produce that came out of my garden that had a bug on it, I wouldn't be eating very much food.
yeah,
So I
Patty
think,
just threw a great one in there too. Thanks, Patty. Obviously, you know quite a bit as well there, so I appreciate you chiming in. But she talks about soaking in a weak salt solution to
yeah.
clean them before eating. That's a great one. So
Definitely. And Patty had one last question, and then I'm going to leave it for tonight. She has stink horn mushrooms growing in her area. Any tips on getting rid of them?
eradicating them. I saw that one. No, I'm sorry. I don't have any experience with trying to eradicate stinkhorns.
All
Sorry.
right. I think we got through all the questions. So that has been absolutely amazing. I am so very glad that you reached out to work with me on this, and I'm really excited. For anybody who deep dives and wants to learn more, I will be sending out an email tomorrow. So if you didn't grab the link before in the chat, it will go out. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to chat with all of us tonight, for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'm so excited to learn more from you. And until our next collaboration, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a blast. I think Crean will have to do this again. I will send a follow-up email as well with the replay. And I've got a few other kind of follow-up resources, a couple of videos and some stuff, a couple of books that I recommend. So I'll watch for a follow-up email with just a few other additional resources we didn't get to tonight. So, but thanks so much for joining, everybody. Thanks, Crean, for hosting.
Great.
I had a blast as always.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and
Good
thank
night,
you to the
everyone.
fungi. Thank you to the mushrooms.